In the last video, I talked about how the different cultural strands of antiquity influenced the Middle Ages, and I want to pick up on some of those in the next few video lectures here. The most important text in the Middle Ages, at least for Europe, Christian Europe in the Middle Ages, was the Bible, and there's really no way to equivocate about that or to even, say that there was competition. The Bible was the central text of medieval culture. The learned read it. They patterned their lives after its teachings. They believed in, the prophecies and other things that are contained in the Bible. They determined their view of history by that information. They sort of set their culture to the precedents that were established in the Bible. There were, of course, other influences. The Greeks and the Romans, had a tremendous influence on the way that the Middle Ages took shape. But even that pales in comparison, really, to what the Bible said and the influence that it had on medieval thinkers and the people of the Middle Ages more generally. Even the uneducated, right, were exposed to the Bible. If they didn't read it, they heard stories about it from the clergy. They listened to sermons which told biblical stories. They saw artwork in churches and adorning other buildings. Even public buildings tend to be decorated in sculptures and paintings and things that were of biblical scenes. And so the influence of the Bible on the Middle Ages is really incomparable. And so I wanted to take a look at a few examples of the way the Bible treats calamities, the way the Bible treats war, the way the Bible treats pestilence and famine, the way the Bible treats the topic of death. And then we'll do some of the same for kind of Greco-Roman things. And that will then feed into our discussion of what actually happens in the Middle Ages, because we'll have these cultural legacies in mind. Briefly, I think it's important to understand how the Bible came into being, how this thing developed as a text. I think that the Bible tends to, of course, be circulated in religious communities, and this class is not here to, challenge anyone's belief in the Bible or the information that's contained in it, but I think that there is a general misconception of how the Bible came to be. This is a collection, in fact, a rather large collection of many texts. There are 66 individual books in the Bible. The Bible is divided into two major sections. One, at least the Christian Bible is, I should say. The Jewish Bible or the Hebrew Bible does not have the New Testament, which is the Christian addition to this. The Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible as it's otherwise called, or the word Tanakh actually describes that as well, and I'll explain what that means in a second here, has 39 individual texts, but even those texts probably were not written as, some of them at least, were not written as single texts. They were probably collections of stories and of sayings and even of songs and poems in some cases, that were compiled over time and edited into the texts that continue to remain in the Bible. And over the course of several hundred years, maybe dating back to around the middle of the first millennium BCE, these things started to become standardized. The word for this is canonized, that is, accepted widely by those who had an authoritative say in such things as the accepted canonical texts, right, that everyone should read and everyone should believe in. But that process took many centuries. The Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, is actually divided into three sections. And this is captured by the acronym Tanakh. And these are the Hebrew words for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the three divisions of the text. The Torah entails the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, otherwise known as the Pentateuch in Greek. And this is probably the earliest layer of the text, the first grouping that became canonized, maybe probably between around 600 and 400 BCE. The second group, called the Nevi'im, or the prophets, includes books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, and so forth and so on. They're like longer prophetic books and then shorter prophetic books. This grouping probably was canonized around 200 BCE. And then the third grouping, the Ketuvim, or the writings, probably did not reach its final form until about 100 or so CE. And so less than 2,000 years ago. In fact, that grouping probably didn't become fully canonized until the Christians had started to develop as a religion, and there may have been some kind of mutual influence going on there. So that's the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, and I've given you a few selections from that to read this week. But then there's also this work called the New Testament, and these are, this is gathered together. These are accounts of the life of Jesus, and there are 4 of these that are considered canonical. Actually, in this image here, which comes from the book of Revelation, you have Jesus, framed as he often is in this frame called the mandorla, and then down here we have the elders of Zion, and then up here we have the 4 beasts, which typically are associated with the authors of the canonical Gospels, or the accounts of the life of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so those are maybe the core texts of the New Testament, but then there are lots of letters written by the early disciples of Jesus, particularly the figure known as St. Paul, or Paul of Tarsus. There are, the largest number of them are attributed to Paul, and some of them probably authentically written by Paul. And then there's this text called the Book of Revelation, which is a kind of outlier. It's a different thing. It's more of a mystical text, a kind of esoteric text. It's an account of a vision that the text describes to the Apostle John, known as John the Revelator, or John he's one of the Gospels of Jesus. One of the accounts of the life of Jesus is also attributed to John, right? And it's supposedly the same person who saw this vision, which many have said is a vision of the end of the world, and we want to look at a little bit of that. By about the early 4th century CE, the New Testament was fully canonized, and the Christians put this together with the Old Testament to become the Bible as a single text. Of course, the Jews rejected the New Testament and continued to only think of the Hebrew Bible as Scripture, right? Because they did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the long history of compilation, canonization, transmission. I assigned you 4 texts to read this week, and these are not chosen at random. They are there for a reason, and they're either accounts of war, or they deal with the topic of death, or they have something to do with the course, because again, we want to understand how ancient things affected the culture of the Middle Ages, how they, if the people of the Middle Ages encountered a calamity, they would immediately draw their minds to what the Bible said about that, and that would influence the way they thought about it. So this is maybe the most important piece of context that we can have for understanding the reactions of people in the Middle Ages to things like war and plague and death, right? I'm going to start, and I'll do this, I'll do a couple of these and then I'll break, because I don't want these videos to become too long. I'll try to keep them to about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I'll come back with a second video and do the rest of these. So let's start with Genesis. And I've given you the New International Version. If you are more comfortable with a different version, feel free. There are lots of different translations here you can see, okay? Feel free to use whichever one you are comfortable with. But this one's a fairly straightforward translation. Chapters 3 and 4 of Genesis, which is, of course, the very first book in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, is the account of creation. But immediately following the account of creation, we have the account of what is known as the fall, right? Where Adam and Eve were the first man and woman created by God, as the story tells. And they were put in a garden, which was known as Eden, and it was a perfect place. The trees and the bushes produced food spontaneously. They didn't have to do any work. They, of course, were living in ignorance. They were naked, and they didn't know that, and they weren't ashamed of it or anything. And they seem to have had no knowledge of anything. And, of course, a figure who is simply known here as the serpent. This later becomes associated with the figure of Satan or Lucifer, who is seen as a kind of rebellious angel who was rejected by God and becomes the arch tempter, the great adversary to God. But here it's simply the serpent, and this might have been out of a fear of snakes or something that people had in the ancient world. I don't know. But the serpent comes to Eve and says, oh, is it true that you can eat the tree, you can't eat of that specific tree? Now, God had given them a commandment that one of the trees in the Garden of Eden they couldn't eat from, because if they did, they would die. And Eve says, yeah, we can eat of the fruit of the trees, but we can't eat of that tree because God said we'll die. And the serpent says, and look at verse 4 here, you will not certainly die, the serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So eating this fruit seems to give them some kind of knowledge, right? Specifically the difference between good and evil. And so Eve, tempted by this, decides to eat, and she gives it to Adam, and he eats it as well. And then both of them, it says their eyes were opened, and they realized they were naked, right? So they become ashamed of that. They recognize that there's something wrong with that somehow. Again, this probably just reveals sexual taboos in the ancient world are, I suppose, shared by most cultures in world history. And then God confronts them, right? And he confronts Adam, and Adam's like, well, it was the woman's fault. Typical man to blame the woman here, I guess, right? And Eve then, sort of says, well, yeah, I was beguiled by the serpent, right? And he deceived me and I ate of it. And then God curses them. And this is an important thing, right? This seems to be the explanation for conflict. This is also the origin of death, right? God doesn't kill them immediately, but he does say, yes, you're going to live a hard life, right? He curses the serpent, first of all, but then he curses the woman and says, you're going to have a hard time bearing children. He curses the man, or he curses the ground, rather, and says you're going to have to really work to produce food from the soil. And ultimately, you are going to die until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. And so Adam and Eve are cursed to die, right? This introduces both conflict and death into the world. And a lot of those topics, right, are viewed through the lens of this origin story, right? That we live in a fallen world because of the sin of Adam and Eve, because of what Christians later call, it starts really with St. Augustine, calls original sin. We also are cursed. And the following story, the one that shows up in chapter 4, really seems to be a kind of follow-on from the fall. Adam and Eve have children, and their children have differences between them. Here you have, the two children are born to them are Cain and Abel, and this may be indicative of social relationships in the ancient world as well. That may be the origin of this. Abel kept the flocks, and Cain worked the soil. So Abel is a pastoralist or a herder, and Cain is a farmer. And it seems that those who wrote this prized herding over farming. This may be tracing its roots back to the agricultural revolution, to stories that were told out of that, right? That some people made their living by raising animals and others by working the land. This produces the conflict because, according to this, God respects Abel's offering and looks with favor on it. I mean, he brings him an animal, but Cain brings him some of the fruit of the soil, and God doesn't like that. And so God seems to like the herders more than he likes the farmers. And Cain gets angry about this. God confronts him, and Cain is still angry. And ultimately, Cain takes Abel out in the field and kills him, commits murder. And then God curses Cain, right? He says, because you have murdered, there is a consequence. And so again, this becomes a lens through it, and the consequence is pretty severe, right? That he will be driven from the ground, and when he works the ground, it will no longer yield its crops, and he will be a restless wanderer on the earth somehow. And Cain says, well, my punishment is bad, and somebody finds me, they're going to kill me. And God says, no, I'm going to make it so people don't kill you. But Cain is just consigned to wander, right? That is the consequence or the curse put on murder. Now, again, we're talking about war. We're talking about taking people's lives. We're talking about killing people. This story becomes a way to understand that. And it leads to, then, Jewish and Christian thinkers saying, well, is there some circumstance where people would be justified in killing other people? If they're defending themselves, or a good cause, for instance, or they're fighting to protect the weak, or, and this leads to the notion of, a war or a conflict being just, that murder may be justified in some instances, even though it was not in the original murder where Cain killed Abel. All right. I think I'm going to stop there for this video, and I'll pick up the Exodus and